Captain Elijah Turner stood at the edge of the airlock, his hands clasped behind his back as the alien vessel docked with his ship. The hum of the engines filled the silence of the bridge. He had been briefed on the situation, but nothing could prepare him for what was about to happen. The communication came through a few moments earlier, a garbled message from the Croatian Empire declaring the arrival of a gift. Turner had no idea what that meant, but he was certain of one thing: no gift from the Croatians would be anything to celebrate. The airlock doors hissed open, and two figures through both were unlike anything Turner had ever seen. One was a tall, slender woman with smooth metallic skin. Her eyes were a piercing violet that seemed to flicker with a strange light as she glanced at him. The other was a child barely out of his infancy. His appearance was no less alien, but in a way he reminded Turner of a human child with wide, curious eyes and a look that held far too much intelligence for his age. The woman, the Croatian gift-bearer, spoke without preamble in a language that was incomprehensible to Turner. He could not make out a single word, though the tone of her voice carried an emotion of deep sorrow. She gestured toward the child and then at Turner, as though expecting him to understand her meaning. Turner swallowed hard and nodded in an attempt to maintain control of the situation. His mind raced, trying to process everything. What was he supposed to do with them? Were they prisoners or captives? Did the Croatians truly expect him to take care of them with no explanation? It didn't make sense. Then he saw the insignia of the Croatian Empire displayed on their clothing. It was the mark of a conquered people, the Illyrians. The woman's face darkened when she noticed his gaze, and for a fleeting moment, Turner saw the weight of suffering in her eyes. Her expression was one of loss, deep loss and betrayal. Turner instinctively took a step forward, unsure of how to comfort a woman from a race so far removed from humanity. They weren't even supposed to exist. In the eyes of the Croatians, they were expendable, their very presence a reminder of the galaxy's brutal hierarchy. And yet here they were before him, no longer subjects of the Croatian Empire, but something else, something more. He extended his hand, not knowing whether she would take it or push it away. Talana, the woman, hesitated for a long moment. Then slowly, she reached out her hand and grasped his. It was cold. Her touch seemed to send a ripple of energy through him, and for a second Turner swore he felt a pulse of power, something ancient and raw in that touch. She held his gaze for a long time, but said nothing, only nodded almost imperceptibly. Turner wasn't sure what that meant, but the moment of silent understanding between them felt like an unspoken bond that stretched beyond words. It was a promise, a commitment without any need for explanation. Talana and her child were no longer Croatian property. They were people, and Captain Elijah Turner would protect them as his own. He wasn't sure what awaited them or how this would end, but there was no going back now. The air around them seemed to shift, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Captain Turner stood by the observation window, watching as the stars drifted by. The ship's engines hummed quietly in the background. He hadn't expected his life to change like this. The strange woman, Talana, and her child Zorath were in the mess hall with the crew, but Turner had kept his distance, unsure of what to say or how to act. Talana had been reserved, barely speaking to anyone except for the occasional glance toward her son. Zorath had a quiet presence, his large dark eyes constantly observing everything around him. Sometimes Turner caught the boy looking at him, as if studying him, as though he could see something beyond what was visible. The crew was equally uneasy. They had never encountered an alien race this close before. Most of their missions had been dealing with the Croatians or their allies. But Talana was different. She wasn't an enemy. She wasn't even a soldier. She was just a mother trying to survive. And her son had powers that defied everything they knew about alien biology. Turner had watched Zorath manipulate the energy fields around him without even trying. During a routine check in the cargo bay, the boy's hand had glowed faintly, and the lights around them flickered. It wasn't enough to cause a problem, but the way Zorath had done it with such ease unsettled Turner. There was something extraordinary about him, something that set him apart from any alien they had encountered. The next morning, Turner made his way to the mess hall to speak with Talana. He had thought about how to approach the situation for days, but every time he thought he had a plan, the words failed him. When he entered the room, Talana was sitting alone at the table. Zorath was absent, likely with one of the other crew members who had taken an interest in the boy. Turner sat down across from her. She looked up, but didn't say anything. She just studied him in silence for a long time, her eyes deep and filled with unspoken thoughts. Turner felt the weight of the moment pressing on him as he spoke. "I'm not sure what the Trojans wanted to achieve by sending you here, but I'll protect you both, I promise." T'Lana didn't respond right away. Instead, she sighed quietly, as if the weight of the universe was pressing down on her shoulders. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a sorrow Turner hadn't expected. "They thought you would treat us as prisoners, that you would see us as less than what we are, but I can see in your eyes you don't feel that way." Turner nodded, his mind racing, trying to understand the meaning behind her words. "What happened to your people? Why were you sent here?" T'Lana looked down in her hands for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "We were once great, our people, the Illyrians. We built technologies and created wonders that the galaxy had never seen, but the Trojans came, they destroyed us, they enslaved us. And now I am all that is left of a once mighty civilization." Turner felt a pang of guilt for not knowing any of this history. He had only seen the Illyrians as victims of the Trojan conquest, but to hear it from T'Lana's mouth made him realize how much he still had to learn about the galaxy and its people. "And Zorath?" Turner asked quietly. "What about him?" T'Lana's eyes softened as she glanced toward the door where Zorath stood watching them. He looked up at her and then at Turner, his gaze intense, almost unnerving. "Zorath has something inside him, something ancient, something from our people's past. He doesn't fully understand it yet, but it's growing stronger." Turner's heart skipped a beat. The boy was more than just an innocent child. He was something much more, and Turner had no idea what that meant for all of them. Captain Turner couldn't shake the weight of T'Lana's words. Something inside her son, something ancient growing stronger. It gnawed him throughout the day as he watched Zorath from a distance. The boy was unlike any child Turner had ever met. His eyes held an intensity that unsettled him, as though Zorath knew something the rest of them didn't. It was in his mannerisms, the way he moved so gracefully, almost as though he was in tune with everything around him. Turner tried to dismiss the thought, but it lingered. Zorath wasn't just a child of the Illyrians. He was a symbol of their legacy, of a power long forgotten by the galaxy, one that the Trojans clearly feared and possibly desired for themselves. Turner sat in his quarters late that night, staring out into the infinite stars, his mind racing. He had never been good at understanding alien cultures, even after all his years of military service. But he understood enough to know that the Trojans would stop at nothing to take back what they thought belonged to them. The Illyrians were no longer just another conquered race. They were something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. T'Lana had mentioned her people's ancient technology, their advances that once shaped the galaxy, but Turner had no idea what that meant in practical terms. How could something so powerful be hidden away? And why had it been forgotten for so long? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It opened slightly, and Zorath stepped in, his small form barely noticeable in the dim light. Turner turned to face him, surprised to see the boy standing there alone. "Zorath," he said softly. The boy didn't speak, but walked over to the desk where Turner had been sitting for the past few hours. His small fingers reached out and touched the surface of the table. A soft hum filled the room, and Turner froze in place. The hum seemed to vibrate through the walls and floor, as if the ship itself were responding to the boy's presence. Turner blinked in disbelief. The energy coming from Zorath was unmistakable. It was the same kind of energy that had briefly surged through the ship's systems during the earlier moments of battle. Zorath looked up at him, his eyes glowing faintly with a strange light. Turner felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you doing?" Turner asked, his voice almost a whisper. Zorath didn't answer. Instead, he continued to concentrate, his fingers moving along the surface of the desk, as if he was communicating with it, as if the desk was something more than just a piece of furniture. Suddenly, the humming stopped, and Zorath pulled his hand back, looking at Turner with a knowing gaze, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Turner struggled to process what he had just witnessed, but before he could speak, Zorath's voice came in a whisper. "I don't understand it either, but it's getting stronger. I can feel it every day." Turner felt a knot tighten in his chest. The boy wasn't just exhibiting strange abilities. He was beginning to control something that no human had ever seen before. And if he didn't understand it, neither did anyone else. The boy seemed to read his thoughts as his gaze softened, and he slowly stepped back, his hands clasped together. "I don't want to hurt anyone." Zorath's voice was barely audible, but there was something in it that spoke volumes. Turner realized the weight of responsibility on this child's small shoulders was unimaginable. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a key to something much bigger, something that had the potential to either save or destroy them all. Just then, Talana appeared in the doorway, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. "It's happening faster than I thought," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't know how to control it, but he's beginning to understand the power inside him." Turner met her gaze, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them. This was no longer just about protecting them from the Crosians. It was about understanding Zorath's power before it was too late. They were all walking a dangerous path, and no one knew where it would lead. Captain Turner spent the next few days trying to make sense of everything that had happened aboard his ship. The strange events surrounding Zorath were becoming harder to ignore. The boy's abilities were growing stronger every day, and Turner couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. It wasn't just the power that scared him, it was the fact that they didn't understand it, they didn't know where it came from or what it could do. Talana had spoken of the Illyrians, once great civilization, and their advanced technology. But now it seemed like their greatest gift was also their greatest burden. Zorath's abilities were tied to something ancient, something long forgotten by the rest of the galaxy, something that had the potential to reshape everything. Turner knew that the Crosians had to know about it. They had to have known about it for years, and if they wanted it back, they would stop at nothing to get it. But the longer Turner watched Zorath, the more he realized that the boy wasn't just a pawn in some larger game. He was a living connection to something far greater than either the Crosians or humanity had ever imagined. One evening, Turner found himself alone in the observation deck, staring out at the vast expanse of space. As he mulled over his options, he had already sent a message to Fleet Command, requesting reinforcements, but he knew it would take days for them to arrive. And by then the Crosians might have already made their moves. Suddenly the comm system crackled to life. A voice interrupted the silence. It was a voice Turner recognized immediately. It was from the Crosian Empire. "Captain Turner, we know what you have aboard your ship, and we want it back." The voice was cold and menacing. Turner's heart sank. The message was clear. The Crosians weren't just threatening him, they were making a demand. The tone in their message suggested they knew exactly what Zorath was capable of, and they wanted him back. Turner didn't hesitate. He immediately ordered the crew to go on high alert. He couldn't let them get Zorath, no matter what it took. Talana appeared on the bridge, her face pale and filled with worry. "They know, don't they?" she asked, her voice shaking. Turner nodded grimly. "They know, and they're coming for him." Talana closed her eyes as if the weight of the situation had finally hit her. "I should have known. They would never let us go. They never wanted peace. They only wanted to use us." Her voice faltered as she looked at her son, who had just entered the room. Zorath's eyes were wide with fear, but there was also a strange calmness in them. It was as though he knew what was coming, and he accepted it. Turner placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're not going to let them take him. We'll fight if we have to." But deep down, Turner wasn't sure if they had the strength to fight what was coming. The Crosians weren't just an enemy army, they were a ruthless empire with resources and technology far beyond anything the humans had ever seen. Turner knew that the coming battle wouldn't be just about protecting Zorath, it would be about survival. The Crosians wanted the boy's power, and they would stop at nothing to take it. They weren't just fighting for control of a conquered species anymore. They were fighting for something that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy, and if they succeeded, the consequences would be unimaginable. Turner turned to his crew and gave the order to prepare for battle. The ship's systems roared to life as they scrambled into position, but Turner knew that the battle ahead would be unlike anything they had ever faced. They weren't just up against enemy ships or alien soldiers, they were up against an entire empire that would burn the galaxy to get what they wanted. And now they were coming for Zorath. The air in the command center was thick with tension as Captain Turner stared at the tactical display on the wall. The Crosian fleet was rapidly closing in on their position, a swarm of ships that seemed endless and relentless. The crew worked feverishly to prepare the ship for battle, but no one spoke. Their anxiety was palpable. Turner's mind raced. The Crosians were powerful, but they had never encountered anything like Zorath or the energy he could manipulate. Talana had warned him that the boy's abilities were unpredictable, that they were tied to something ancient, something that could either be their salvation or their destruction. Zoreth stood beside Turner, his small frame barely noticeable in the crowded command center, but his presence was undeniable. Every person in the room seemed to be aware of him and the strange force that radiated from him. His eyes were closed, and his hands were pressed against the floor, as if connecting with the ship itself. Turner watched him carefully. The boy had grown quieter over the past few hours, almost as if he was preparing for something big. Tilano was standing a few paces away, her face grim and worried. She watched her son closely as he seemed to draw strength from the ship itself, his small body trembling slightly as the energy surged around him. "Captain, we need to move now," one of the officers called out, his voice tight with urgency. Turner didn't hesitate. He gave the command to engage the Crozian ships. The sound of the ship's engines roared to life as the ship lurched forward in a desperate attempt to break free from the encroaching fleet. The first shots came fast and brutal. The Crozian warships unleashed a barrage of plasma fire that shook their ship to its core, but Turner had anticipated this. He ordered evasive maneuvers, and the ship weaved between blasts as the crew scrambled to return fire. But they were outmatched in terms of firepower. The Crozians had overwhelming numbers, and their weapons were far more advanced than anything they had aboard this ship. They couldn't win this battle with strength alone. They needed something else, something unexpected. Just as Turner was about to order another retreat, Zoreth opened his eyes, his gaze locked onto the tactical display, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The energy that had been swirling around him now began to pulse with intensity. Turner watched in awe as the boy's hands lifted and the ship trembled again. The hum of the engines changed. It was as though the very air around them had shifted. And then it happened. The ship's energy systems suddenly surged to life, and a massive shockwave of energy shot out from Zoreth's small frame. It washed over the ship and then out into space, striking the Crozian fleet with terrifying force. The closest warship was hit first, its shields flaring before it buckled under the force of the blast. The ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, sending debris in all directions. Zoreth collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged and shallow. As the energy drained from him, Turner moved toward him, but Tilano was faster. She knelt beside her son and wrapped her arms around him as he gasped for air, his small form trembling with exhaustion. "Zoreth, you did it," she whispered, her voice a mixture of pride and fear. Turner's mind raced in disbelief. The boy had just single-handedly taken down one of the Crozian warships and sent a shockwave through their fleet. But at what cost? Zoreth was visibly drained, his skin pale and his body shaking with the aftermath of using such immense power. Turner knew they couldn't keep this up. They had just won a battle, but the war was far from over. The Crozians would retaliate. They would come for them with everything they had. But now there was a glimmer of hope. Zoreth had shown them what he was capable of, and it was far beyond anything Turner had ever imagined. But they still had to survive. The Crozian Empire wouldn't back down, and neither would they. They had no choice but to fight back with everything they had. Captain Turner watched as Zoreth rested in his mother's arms. The boy was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and uneven. The energy he had released had taken everything out of him, and now his small frame trembled with exhaustion. Tilano was doing her best to comfort him, but there was fear in her eyes. She knew what the boy was capable of, but she also knew the price of such power. It had drained him completely, and they couldn't afford to let him use it again unless they had no other choice. Turner turned to his crew, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and terror. They had all witnessed the unimaginable power Zoreth had unleashed, and now they were looking to him for direction. But Turner didn't have the answers. They were no longer just facing a battle for survival. They were caught in a larger war that they didn't fully understand, yet he had to keep them focused, had to keep them moving forward. "Status report," he barked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The officer at the helm quickly spoke up. "We've taken heavy damage, sir. The Crozian fleet is regrouping. They're deploying reinforcements. We don't have much time before they overwhelm us." Turner cursed under his breath. The situation was dire, but it wasn't hopeless. Not yet. The fact that Zoreth had been able to use such power meant that the Crozians were vulnerable. They had been caught off guard by the boy's abilities, and now they were in disarray. But Turner knew the Crosians would adapt quickly. They always did. And if they figured out what Zorath was capable of, they would stop at nothing to capture him. They had to move quickly and decisively, prepare for evasive maneuvers. I want all weapons online and ready to fire. Turner ordered. The crew worked quickly to implement his commands. But Turner couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. The Crosians were not just a military force. They were an empire driven by greed and power. And if they wanted Zorath, they would do anything to get him. Turner had no doubt that they would send more ships after him, more soldiers, and worse. They would send those who knew how to deal with powers like Zorath's, and Turner didn't know if they were ready for that kind of fight. Just as he was about to give the order to move out, the comm system buzzed to life again. This time, it wasn't a message from the Crosians. It was a distress signal, a garbled transmission coming from a nearby ship. It was faint, but Turner could make out a few words. Help us, Crosian. Trap. The transmission cut off abruptly. Turner looked at Tilana. She was still holding Zorath closely, her face pale with worry. Should we respond? She asked, her voice filled with hesitation. Turner weighed the options. They couldn't afford to waste time, but they couldn't ignore someone in need. Either send a team to investigate, he said after a long pause. We can't leave them behind. The crew worked quickly to prepare a small team for the mission. Turner knew it was a risk, but they couldn't afford to alienate any potential allies right now. The Crosians were closing in fast, and every ship, every person they could count on would be invaluable in the coming fight. The team boarded a shuttle and left the ship, heading toward the coordinates of the distress signal. Turner watched them go, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. The Crosians were still out there, and they were far from finished. If anything, the battle had only just begun. But as the shuttle disappeared into the distance, Turner had one glimmer of hope. Something in the back of his mind told him that the mission wasn't just about saving whoever had sent the signal. It was about uncovering more about the Crosians and the true extent of the power they were up against. Turner knew that this fight would require everything they had and more. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to reclaim the future. Captain Turner stood at the command center, staring out at the display of the vast empty space surrounding them. The ship was still in motion, but the tension in the air was palpable. They had sent the team to investigate the distress signal, and now they waited anxiously for their return. The Crosian fleet was still regrouping, and Turner knew it was only a matter of time before they launched another attack. Zorath had barely regained consciousness since his last display of power, and now he lay in a quiet corner of the medical bay, resting. Tilana had stayed by his side. She refused to leave him, even for a moment. Her concern for her son was evident, but so was her determination. She knew what the boy was capable of. She understood the risks better than anyone, and she knew they were in a race against time to figure out how to control the power within him before it consumed them all. Turner couldn't blame her for her worry, but he also couldn't afford to focus only on Zorath, not when the Crosians were closing in on them. He had to make difficult decisions, and he had to do it fast. Just as he was about to speak to the officer at the helm, the comm system crackled to life. The voice that came through was strained and distorted, but unmistakable. Captain, this is Shuttle Team. We found the source of the distress signal. Turner's heart skipped a beat. Go ahead, what's the situation? The voice on the other end sounded urgent. It's a Crosian trap, sir. We've located an abandoned Crosian vessel drifting in the debris field. But it's a setup. They knew we respond. Turner's stomach churned as he processed the words. The Crosians had lured them into a trap. They had known the ship would come, and now they were ready to spring it. How bad is it? Turner asked, his voice tense. Very bad, sir. We've been hit. The Crosian ship has disabled our engines. We're drifting, and the Crosians are incoming. The voice paused and then continued. We need immediate assistance, or we'll be overrun. Turner didn't hesitate. I'm sending a rescue team. Stay where you are. We'll get you out. He turned to the officer at the helm. Set a course for the distressed coordinates, maximum speed. The officer nodded and worked quickly to adjust their course. But Turner knew they were already too late. The Crosians would already be on their way to the shuttle site. They wouldn't waste any time. They had the upper hand. Turner was preparing for the worst when the comms buzzed again. This time, it was Tilana, her voice filled with quiet urgency. Captain, we need to talk about Zorath. Turner turned to face her. Her face was pale, but there was a fire in her eyes, a determination that matched his own. "What is it?" Turner asked, his voice sharp. "I'm afraid he's losing control." Talana's words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean losing control?" he demanded. Talana's eyes flicked toward the medical bay, where Zorath lay unconscious for the moment. The power inside him, it's growing stronger, but he doesn't know how to contain it. He's struggling, and it's affecting his health. She paused, taking a deep breath. The longer this goes on, the more dangerous it becomes. Turner felt the weight of her words settling in his chest. The boy wasn't just a weapon or a symbol of their hopes. He was a living force that could turn against them if they didn't learn how to manage it. "We can't afford to lose him." "Not now," Turner said, his voice firm. "I'll do everything I can, but right now we have to get through this fight first." Talana nodded, but Turner could see the doubt in her eyes. She understood the stakes better than anyone. The Crosians weren't just trying to capture Zorath, they were trying to harness the power within him, and that meant the fight wasn't just for survival, it was for control over something that could change the fate of the galaxy forever. Just then the alert sounded. The Crosian fleet was coming. They had no more time. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. Turner turned to the crew, his voice loud and commanding. "Prepare for battle, all hands to their stations." The ship shuddered as it surged forward toward the Crosian trap, but Turner wasn't sure if they would survive this fight, or if Zorath's power would be their salvation or their doom. The ship hurtled through space towards the Crosian trap. Captain Turner's mind raced with calculations, strategies, and contingencies, but nothing could prepare him for what was about to unfold. As they drew closer to the shuttle's last known position, the Crosian fleet emerged from the darkness like a wall of predators, their ships a massive, sleek, menacing designs ready to tear apart anything in their path. Turner knew they didn't have the firepower to take them head on. Their only hope was to find a way to outsmart them, but that was becoming more difficult with every passing second. The closer they got, the more the pressure weighed on him. The crew scrambled to prepare the weapon systems and engage the defensive shields, but the Crosians were already preparing their attack waves. Turner's stomach twisted as the first barrage of plasma fire hit their ship that sent them careening to the side. The ship groaned under the assault, but it held together for now. "Brace for impact," Turner shouted as the ship rocked again. Zorath's small form was still unconscious in the medical bay, but Turner knew the boy's power was the only thing that could give them a fighting chance. If only they could find a way to harness it. They couldn't afford another catastrophic mistake, and they couldn't afford to rely solely on Zorath's strength, not when the boy was still struggling to understand his own abilities. "Captain, the Crosians are advancing too quickly. We can't outrun them," the officer at the helm reported. Turner's mind raced. He had no time left and no more options. But then he remembered the boy's last display of power, the shockwave that had devastated one of the Crosian warships. That was their opening. Their only hope was to make Zorath use that power again. But he didn't know how to control it, and even worse, he wasn't sure if the boy could survive another surge of that magnitude. But there was no other choice. "Talana, we need him awake," Turner said urgently. Talana stood beside him, her face pale with worry. "He's in no condition to fight. He can barely breathe as it is," she replied, but there was a fire in her eyes that matched Turner's own. "We need him to try," Turner insisted, his voice firm. She hesitated, but then nodded. She knew that Zorath's power was their only hope. "Zorath," she whispered as she knelt beside him, her hand gently brushing through his hair. "We need you to help us. Zorath, please." Zorath stirred, his small body twitching as if in response to her voice. His eyes fluttered open and locked onto hers, his face pale, but there was clarity in his gaze. "I don't know if I can," he whispered, his voice weak. "I'm scared." Talana's voice softened with compassion. "You can do this, Zorath. You have the power inside of you. You are the hope for all of us." Zorath hesitated, his breathing labored as he gathered what little strength he could find. But then he nodded weakly, his small hands trembling. "I'll try." With that, he lifted his hands toward the ceiling. The energy inside him began to hum again, soft at first, but growing with every passing second. The ship's systems shuddered as though responding to him. The power inside Zorath was building once more, but it was different this time. It felt more controlled, more focused. Turner could feel it too. The power that had once terrified him now felt like a chance, a spark of hope as the energy swirled around them. "Zorath," gasped, his face contorted with effort As he struggled to hold on to it, the ship groaned again, though the strain was too much, but Zorath pushed forward, his eyes now glowing with an intensity that matched the power he was channeling. Turner held his breath as the boy released it. The shockwave of energy surged from Zorath's hands. It wasn't just a wave, it was a blast of raw power that tore through the Crosian fleet. With a deafening roar, the energy ripped through their ships like paper as they exploded in a chain reaction. The Crosian fleet staggered and disintegrated under the force of the blast, their ships falling apart in all directions. But the energy didn't stop, it continued to surge outward, and Turner could feel it beginning to destabilize the ship. He had to act evasive maneuvers now. Turner shouted. The crew scrambled to obey. But it was too late. The ship rocked violently. As the energy began to dissipate, Zorath's body collapsed once more, his strength drained from the effort. The ship's engines sputtered and groaned, but it held together. The Crosian fleet was decimated, but now they had to survive the aftermath. Turner looked around the command center. Everyone was still alive, but they had no time to celebrate. "Get us out of here now," he ordered. The crew worked swiftly, but Turner's thoughts were with Zorath and Tilana. They had won, but the cost had been too high, and the boy's future was uncertain. As they drifted into the safety of deep space, Turner couldn't help but wonder what the next step would be for them. All the galaxy had changed in an instant, and now they would have to navigate a future that was no longer defined by the rules they had once known. The battle was over, but the war for the future had only just begun.